coming to you from deep beneath the murky waters that lie beyond the Lake Erie shoreline. This is the Cleveland Podcast! With Fred the Mud Monster and South Bay Caesar. Find us online at facebook.com/The Cleveland Podcast or email us at theclevelandpodcast@gmail.com. Now, join us as we journey through Northeast Ohio and the city of Cleveland.
Hello, welcome to an unexpected special edition of the Cleveland Podcast. This is Caesar. We're doing things a little differently this episode because the world has changed a lot since the last time we recorded. It's unlike anything we've ever experienced before. As Americans, as Clevelanders, as humans, as citizens of the world, as people who are trying our hardest to not only look out for ourselves, but even more so in this situation to look out for one another. When the threat of COVID-19 or coronavirus was looming overseas, not many people here took it very seriously, including myself. My social media feed was inundated with memes about Corona beer. It got really annoying really fast. It's like, how many times can you tell the same joke? It bothered me so much that I told all my social media friends that I was going to snooze them for 30 days if they posted anything related to coronavirus, which I actually kind of did, to a point. Mostly, it was just the people who were being goofy or spreading misinformation about the virus, or just there was nothing else to talk about, so that's what they were talking about, and I just kind of snoozed everybody for a while, just leading up to it. Nobody was taking it very seriously at the time. As we venture into this subject, I want to give people a little bit of context into my personal experience. I don't watch the news. I don't listen to terrestrial radio. Not listening to the local radio was a decision that I made when I first moved to Cleveland, which was thankfully right around the same time that podcasts became even more and more popular. When I realized that podcasts gave me the option to fill my brain with better, more open-minded content, I jumped right on board. Of course, that's as long as the podcasts I choose are the type of podcasts that lead to better thinking. I also download the Onion News each week. That does not fit under the category of podcasts that make me a better person. It does, however, make me laugh a little bit every morning. I'm somebody who likes to listen to people's opinions and hear opposing sides. I like to explore the thoughts and minds of others. I like to gather information and use the best stuff I learn from different people in an effort to evolve and move forward in life. It's how I try to improve my methods of thinking. I tend not to trust the media, and I will explain more why I feel that way later. But I usually stray away from mainstream news, especially far left or far right opinion style news. For me, this meant that I had little idea what was happening until a friend of mine, who is a volunteer in a group that I run, texted me saying that I probably need to start paying attention to this. My response was, "Is it that bad?" Within a week of that, things got real serious real fast. As everybody knows, this has been a big deal so far. Everyone in Ohio has been on lockdown. Bars and restaurants aren't allowed to serve people food or beer unless it's carry-out only. Republican Governor Mike DeWine is being highly praised for being way ahead of the curve compared to other states. And as always, President Trump is being highly scrutinized, this time because he's been more reactive than proactive. DeWine's voluntary decisions are measures that are certain to destroy Ohio's economy, which many people don't seem to be that upset about. Many other states are taking similar measures now. A lot of people feel like it's for the greater good. We're pretty much weighing the potential death of people's loved ones versus the good of the economy. And in an unprecedented time in history, love and unselfishness are winning over money. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell almost 3,000 points on Monday, March 16th, the most in one day since the late 1980s. So Y2K, 9/11, the housing crisis, the Great Recession, none of those previous crises have created this kind of single-day drop. This has been unlike anything I, or of course anybody else, has ever experienced before. Several people, including strangers, approached me when all this began, asking if I was okay. You know, the look on my face was apparently enough to tell a story that I didn't otherwise really want to tell. I was asked to go to some highly contagious areas of the city throughout the early part of that week. The fear that I saw in the eyes of the most vulnerable was humbling for me. The idiocy that I saw in the actions of many people was maddening. I was asked to visit a hospital that was also doubling as a drive-through testing facility for people who were concerned that they might have the virus. Before I got out of my car, I stopped and watched, processed what was happening around me. It looked like something out of a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie. I was in the midst of this for only a few hours, but it was enough to rattle me a little. You know, medical professionals have been dealing with this for 12 hours a day. I can't imagine what that must be like. I have a family member who's a nurse and in an ER, and the things that she deals with on a regular basis would blow the rest of our minds. Over the holidays, someone told a story about how my family member had recently saved the life of a week-old baby who had been rushed to the ER because of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. My family member saved the life of a baby. And when I started to praise her about how amazing that was, she was just like, yeah, that's what I was trained to do, and I did it. As if it were just her duty, you know? Some people are made of different stuff. Anytime people point out how, in a negative way, how some people are odd or different or whatever, I always say, thank God that we're all made different. Someone's got to be the proctologist, and it wasn't going to be me. And I wasn't the one who would ever do CPR on a newborn. As I've talked about in previous podcasts, I panic when in emergency situations. And I'm not the one who's going to dress up in hazmat suits and take swabs from coronavirus patients waiting in line. I have great respect for the people who are willing and also capable of doing these things. And I'm very proud of my family member, as humble as she is. It was around 40 degrees all week, and the weather was just miserable during the panic, which obviously already makes people susceptible to illnesses when it's, 39 degrees and raining, that's when people get sick anyways. And yet this pandemic was coming through. It's late March 2020 right now, and this is meant to be sort of a journal for the future, what life was like during the 2020 coronavirus crisis. Not so much a current events episode. Hopefully we'll look back and reminisce and laugh. I don't know. Hopefully it was all just an overreaction and the world will be completely the same as it was before all of this began. Everybody is pretty much on lockdown right now. We've been told to just stay home. All of the places where we usually record are closed, which means it's been difficult to have guests. We actually had to cancel one episode so far. We've recorded other episodes that the timing was bad and the subject matter that we talked about probably isn't that relevant at this point. We'll probably choose to go ahead and release those episodes anyway. I was personally in a lot of situations recently where I don't feel comfortable going out and potentially exposing the people that I care about to what I've been exposed to myself. So for now, we're just changing the format of the podcast. I'll be sharing some of my thoughts, and then we'll switch over to Fred, and he'll be talking about viruses from the past that affected the world. While the format has changed, we'll try to get creative and come up with some things that are still interesting and relevant. We don't usually talk about current events because by the time we plan for an episode, record it, edit it, and publish it, what we're talking about is often irrelevant and outdated. For us, it would be a lot more fun to just keep going with our usual format, but a lot of what we normally talk about probably isn't all that relevant right now. We could continue recommending restaurants and museums and fun things to do in the city of Cleveland like we usually do, but most of those places are closed for now. And it's entirely possible that some of them won't be there when we get back to normal. Some people seem to think that we're just going to be stuck inside for a few weeks and then life is going to go back to normal. I hope they're right, but I highly doubt it. I personally doubt that the world is going to look exactly the same on the other side of all of this. It's probably going to be different. Anyone who's old enough to remember what it was like before 9/11 probably understands. Americans were all a little more oblivious and lighthearted before September 11th, 2001. Weren't we? There's a country song about September 11th that talks about not knowing the difference between Iraq and Iran, before the September 11th attacks. I feel like that sentiment was a pretty accurate representation of the average American's knowledge of international affairs at the time. Most people didn't concern themselves with overseas politics in the same way that we do today. I suppose a lot of that also coincides with how access to information became so much more easily available right around the same time. But going to an airport back then wasn't a big ordeal. I remember when I was a little kid, my family would just go to airports and watch airplanes take off. I would never do that today. It probably wouldn't even be allowed. In that same way, I can't help but wonder what little things are going to be different on the other side of this. It feels like the revitalization of Cleveland that so many people are excited about and so many people are proud about is highly at risk here. The housing market had been soaring recently. I had recently read an article that confirmed what I already had been seeing myself. The value of homes near Old Brooklyn, Parma, and Lakewood had increased pretty well over the last few years. Downtown's population had been increasing. And of course, as we've talked about on previous episodes, about the amazing new residential buildings that are being built downtown. The economy had been doing amazing in the U.S. for the past few years, but in recent weeks, the stock market has been crashing. And people are predicting that the housing market is about to do the same in the months to come. It's hard not to wonder what this means for the future. We just recently recorded an episode where we talked about the revitalization of Old Brooklyn as the next big Cleveland neighborhood. So much of that revitalization has been due to small business owners starting restaurants and coffee houses. Since the coronavirus arrived, by state mandate, those places have been forced to only serve carryout. I hope that these entrepreneurs make it through this. It's really important to support local businesses right now, probably more than ever. If these restaurants can't make it through this, some of these neighborhoods that have been recovering and thriving lately, I could see them losing momentum in a big way. Many people can't go to work. Schools have been closed, so parents may have to stay home instead of going to their jobs. Libraries have closed. Civic centers have been closed. Museums have been closed. Even Cleveland's beloved St. Patrick's Day parade was canceled. Almost everything is closed except for essential businesses. People who have jobs that are non-essential have been told to stay home for a little while. What does the future hold for them? How will they pay their monthly bills? Every individual's situation is different. This all happened at the end of winter, which in Cleveland always seems so long anyways. People already had cabin fever and couldn't wait to get out of the house. And now that we approach April, we're being asked to stay inside for a few more months. It's brutal. People are sad. People are feeling lonely and stressed and scared and isolated, and we're just at the beginning of all of it. On the bright side, there are a lot of great places to go hiking in Northeast Ohio, and I think people need to start taking advantage of that. Everything else is closed. There's nowhere else to go. And even if there was, it probably wouldn't be a good idea to go there. We'll see how long all of this lasts, but people definitely need to consider their well-being as well as their mental and physical health. I went up to the Willoughby area earlier this week near Lost Nation Road, a suburb northeast of Cleveland. I've never seen so many people just walking around outside in my entire life. The Chagrin River Park was packed with people trying to get outside. When I left the park, the neighborhoods were filled with people just walking around. You never see this. People were forced to go out for a walk out of a lack of other options, which reminds me of a time that I've never witnessed myself, but older people seem to reminisce about it, when people actually went outside and did things, weren't trapped by video games and television. It seems like a lot of good things are coming out of this, maybe. If nothing else, maybe just making us step back and relook at life in a way that we've never been forced to look at it before. I'm going to let Fred talk about some things here. I think he's going to talk about the history and maybe some other viruses from the past as well. Fred, take it away.
Hey, Caesar. Sorry, I have a little bit of a sneeze. We're going to talk about epic pandemics, dangerous plagues, dangerous illnesses that cause so much destruction that the coronavirus in comparison looks like a mere common cold. Why are we talking about this? Why am I talking about this? Great question. I don't know. I'm just here to get paid. No. I'm actually here to tell people that we have this massive hysteria over the coronavirus. I think rightfully so. I mean, it is deadly. Thousands of people have died across multiple countries around the world, and so many countries have it. I mean, for goodness sake, when the Olympics get postponed by a year, you know this illness is bad news. But understand that this illness is quite not as deadly as some of the more infamous illnesses that wind up killing hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, maybe even tens of millions in just a couple of years. And that's really important to note because we overcame that, right? We're here now after those god-awful, epic diseases that ravaged nations and sometimes completely led to kingdoms, nations just folding and just winding up on their knees. But here we are, still standing, still going, still trying to function in this crazy, crazy world that we live in. And let's talk about the first major illness that comes to mind, which is the bubonic plague or the Black Death. Many of you might have heard of it, and there are probably some of you who say, yeah, I've heard about it, but I don't really know too much about it. And the plague is kind of like this specific category of illness. And what's interesting to note is that the bubonic plague is most well known for these little bumps on the lymph nodes, particularly in the neck and the groin area, and they're called buboes, hence the phrase bubonic. In buboes, it has a Greek origin in terms of its word, and it just means like black bumps, pretty much. And it's pretty terrifying when you think about the fact that the bubonic plague occurred most often in the medieval ages. And so in the time of medieval ages, the extent of medical knowledge is, well, if we just cut open their arm, we could just let all the fluids out, and then all the bad fluids go out and all the good fluids should stay in, and then the person should be fine. That was the extent of medicine at that time. And sometimes even then people did not quite know that technique. So people would just often just resort to prayer in order to get through these terrible, terrible illnesses. And when the bubonic plague occurs, it occurs 3 times. There are 3 major pandemics that occur with the bubonic plague. And interesting enough, they're hundreds of years apart each time. The first time is in Europe, which is not the one you're thinking of if you're aware of bubonic plague history. The most infamous one is the 14th century version or the 14th century outbreak. This is actually not the first time. The first time is in the 6th century, located in Turkey and Greece. And that time, that was part of the Byzantine Empire. And so ships from Asia, particularly from China, were sending ships and just doing trade with the Byzantines. And as a result, you had these fleas on these ships. Ships in the 6th century didn't exactly have the most hygienic practices. And as a result, you had these fleas flying around that would, come from the dirty rats and other little critters that would be on board of these ships, attracted to the rotten smells of the ships. And so these fleas would be the ones carrying the plague. And so the fleas emerge from the ships, and then they start spreading this terrible death. And so, when the emperor of the Byzantines first heard this, he thought this was a punishment from God for him just being a bad ruler. And a lot of the Byzantine public agreed. They said, yeah, you're just a bad emperor, man. Like, look at all these people dying. All your fault. And it got so bad to the point that he almost resigned and attempted to flee his own empire until his wife convinced him otherwise. And then he became one of the most famous Byzantine emperors, and Emperor Justinian, if for those who are curious. It's kind of fascinating to see this the first time. And the first time around, there are tens of thousands who die from this plague, but it kind of just stays within the Byzantine Empire. So Greece, Turkey, and then going into parts of Mesopotamia and then Egypt. That's kind of like where it mostly lied. And then it dies out. It lasts for about 100 years. It kind of stops at the very end of the 6th century and going into the 7th century. And then we go into the 14th century, where supposedly rumor has it, or legend has it, that a ship arrived to a port in Italy, and this ship had no one pretty much alive on the ship except for those covered in these buboes, and everyone else had died on the ship. And the people who were there to watch this ship, because there were no game cubes at the time to occupy little children. People would go to these ships. I mean, this was like TV. This was huge. It's like, whoa, like what are these cool things that people bring? Well, these traders brought a bunch of dead bodies and people covered in black marks. And of course, people are terrified, thinking that this is some work of the devil. And so of course, officials at this port said, you cannot be here. You must go back out to sea. You're pretty much going to die out in the sea. But by the time that the ship leaves, the fleas are already escaping from the ship. And so they start to infect the public. And then what's interesting is that this thing spreads so rapidly that people don't know what's going on. And people are just resorting to all types of crazy methods. Plague doctors are just insane in terms of the techniques they do. I mean, many people died from the techniques the doctors would use to try and cure these people who had these ailments. But also the bubonic plague was unbelievably deadly. Pretty much if you had it, you were destined to die, and you were going to die within pretty much 2 weeks, sometimes even quicker, depending on your state of health. And what happened was, with so many people dying, it became such an issue that certain cities in Europe, they couldn't even officially bury their dead. And what wound up was they had bodies just lying on the streets and just kind of like buried in these huge unfinished graves. And so you see piles upon piles of bodies. And in fact, if you if you have ever the chance to go to Paris, you go down to these, if you ever hear about the catacombs, you go down there and you see these piles upon piles of skeleton remains. And a good chunk of those skeletal remains that exist in these catacombs underneath the streets of Paris, they are skulls from the plagues, particularly from the bubonic plague. And the plague is so dangerous that in the 14th century alone, it kills 50 million Europeans, and it devastates cities like Florence, where 90% of the population is wiped out within a couple of years. And so it has this terrible, terrible effect upon Europe. And then globally, the numbers are even more terrifying. Within the 14th century alone, and going a little bit into the 15th century, we see numbers reported as high as 200 million people dying from this pandemic, because it goes into also Africa, Asia, it goes to pretty much every major continent except North America, South America, and Oceania. And what's most interesting about this is, well, most terrifying is that, do note that the world population at this point when the plague occurs is 500 million. So in other words, this plague wipes out almost half of the world population within pretty much 1 century. That is so nutty. That's insane. Imagine the coronavirus killing 3.5 billion people right now. That's what the Black Plague did. So think about that. We overcame that eventually. Now, of course, it took a long, long time. It took hundreds of years to develop proper methods, and we still have issues now. We still have a little outbursts here and there. There was an outburst in 94 in India, and then there was a recent outbreak in Madagascar where over 100 people died. But yet we still have developed the proper methods to overcome this whole issue. And it's a good thing that we obviously developed technology to get over it. But what's most interesting is that if we can get through something that wipes out half of the world population, I think we can get past this coronavirus and we can be better people because of it. And I mentioned really in particular be better people because what often happens in these pandemics is that people flip out, in ways that just are unbelievably irrational. People just lose their minds and they come up with these crazy crackpot theories that try and figure out the cause and, who really spread this disease. And if you looked at the news recently, our always so wonderful president, is been trying to say that this is the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus. And so people around the world saying, oh, that's just ridiculous. No way. Why on earth would we call it that? People were like, yeah, that's right. This is all China's fault. And if you go to the New York Times, you'll see an article that talks about people of Chinese descent, East Asian descent that receive these verbal and racial abuses as a result of this sudden growth of the coronavirus. In fact, the beginning story talks about this woman who's in San Francisco, and this man is just saying horrible things about China, just cursing, and this swearing. And then what's interesting is that the woman is kind of like near the guy, and all of a sudden the man just spits right in her face. There's a number of these instances. There's been dozens upon dozens of instances that have occurred now within the past month or so. Pandemics really cause people to really lose their minds a little bit. One thing that kind of in particular I think about is, the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. People were like, well, it's a gay disease, it's a disease amongst, homosexuals, and, it's their deviant ways of doing all this crazy stuff. But you have this increase in, in homosexuals in particular being affected by HIV/AIDS. You have people who just started to be so angry and evil towards those of homosexual orientation. And, that's not right. We can't just target people because for something that they did not cause or something they did not do. And instead, we need to treat people with compassion and understand that everyone's suffering here. This current outbreak, people having a tough time with being stuck in the homes, and it's increasing anxiety and depression. And, and that's, for people who are non-Chinese and those of Chinese descent. And, we have to treat people with compassion. We have to really understand the issues that plague everyone. This virus goes after everyone, just like AIDS. And to give context a little even more than that, AIDS has been a terrible killer of many people around the world. And AIDS has killed alone around almost 700,000 people since the 60s. And yet we are still freaking out about the coronavirus, which rightfully so. But again, if we can overcome the crisis of AIDS, we can, at least we're getting better at overcoming the crisis of AIDS, then we can certainly get past this coronavirus thing. I mean, after all, 18,000 people alone per year die of HIV/AIDS in the United States, and that's according to Wikipedia, and then according to websites that cover pandemics. And lastly, this last disease that I wanted to mention is the flu. And, the flu kills tens of thousands of people per year all around the world. And it's still a pretty terrible disease. And we pretty much have normalized that the flu is very dangerous, and that without proper care, if you don't have the proper money in order to get to the proper doctors in certain countries, and as a result, you have people who die from the flu, particularly from the pneumonia symptom. And at one point in time, due to that lack of healthcare access for people, particularly in 1918, where income inequality was just as bad, if not worse, back then, you had people who just were unable to get to the hospital. And in addition, the hospitals were so crammed with World War I veterans because in 1918, the war is ending. the World War I, and this is the great global catastrophe with 20 million people dying in 4 years. And then in the flu, which this is really a 2 or 3 year epidemic, really, but most people die in 1918. We see 50 million people die, and most of them died during 1918. That means that this flu, starting in 1918, killed more than double of the amount of people who died during World War I, which is just an insane number to think about. I can't even fathom what that would look like today. What's kind of most fascinating about that is that eventually we came up with heavier push towards trying to better the healthcare system and improve sanitary conditions in hospitals, because even though they were getting better in the early 20th century, they still had issues that caused the spread of this flu to spread like crazy, because, soldiers would catch it in the hospitals, and then the hospitals were dirty, and then they spread it to other people, and then they return home, and then they would spread it to the people around in their hometowns, and then it just started to spread more and more rapidly because you had so many soldiers from so many countries returning home, and that's why this thing was such a global outbreak. If you're curious, you should look at these news articles from 1918 that you can find on historical archives and websites, and you could see just the amount of panic is so unbelievable. Every single major newspaper around the world just writes hundreds and hundreds of articles on this major crisis that occurs. And you can kind of just see what a crisis that was even more crazy than the one we have now looks like. And you can see proof of it through the digital archives of historians and librarians. And so I bring up this last one, this particular flu of 1918, which, by the way, if you're curious, it's the Spanish flu. I bring this up because, again, this is something that we also overcame too. We've overcome these horrific, so terrifying illnesses that we became a better society. We became better people as a result of these illnesses. And, and it's important to note that with the coronavirus, this will happen too. It will fundamentally change our society, most likely, in many countries around the world. But yet we could still become better people. We could still hold compassion. We can still not let our fears conquer us and just continue to do the right thing, like continue the social distancing and wash your hands and just remain calm, because there will be a solution to this. And we have modern medicine, which, trust me, I'm pretty sure people from 1918, from the people who didn't have AIDS medication in the 1980s and those who didn't have antibiotics in the 14th century, I'm pretty sure that they would be tremendously grateful if those things existed. And, if they had the wonderful medical research facilities that we have now. Say what you will about the political craziness and the gridlock and that's occurring, that's damaging the recovery effort regarding the coronavirus. But the important thing is that we live in a world that is capable of tackling this virus and limiting deaths. Who knows what would happen if this virus was spreading around the time of the 14th century instead of the bubonic plague? Who knows what would happen? More people die, maybe millions of people would die from this coronavirus thing in a rapid period of time. And it's important to note that, we need to stay calm and we need to stay positive in all of this, because if we can overcome these illnesses that cause millions of deaths and clearly killed half of the world's population, I think we can survive an illness that, although deadly, has not killed nearly that many and won't kill nearly that many. Back to you, Caesar.
Thank you for that, Fred. The first 3 confirmed cases of coronavirus in Ohio were here in Cuyahoga County. At first, it was explained that healthy young people don't need to worry about their own health, but they do need to worry about passing it on to their parents, who might pass it on to their parents, and then grandma could die. Since then, we've heard reports of young people in China not completely recovering as well. All sports have been canceled. The NCAA was set to play March Madness without fans because of the virus. But within the week, NBA games were canceled because 2 players tested positive for the virus. All the fans came to the stadium and were sitting ready for the game to start, and they were all sent home. That same night, actor Tom Hanks and his wife announced that they had contracted the virus. Things got real fast. Within 24 hours, The NHL and Major League Baseball suspended their seasons indefinitely. The March Madness tournament was canceled, and then even NASCAR canceled their races. It's mind-blowing to think that sports have been canceled. Think about it. All sports have been canceled indefinitely. Has that ever happened before? Maybe in wartime? I'm not sure. Not in my lifetime. This is all so unprecedented and strange. These are strange times that we're living in. Then, the strangest thing of all happened. Toilet paper hoarders. People flocked to the grocery stores and fought over toilet paper, buying as much of it as they could. It made no sense whatsoever. I mean, people hoarded legitimate things too, but people were inexplicably preparing for the toilet paper apocalypse, which became a self-fulfilling prophecy. All stores everywhere were out of toilet paper and were unable to restock their shelves. People went to eBay and Amazon and attempted to price gouge desperate people who were out of supplies, which eBay and Amazon both thankfully put a stop to. These are the worst kind of people who deserve a special place in you know where. About a week after the stores ran out of hand sanitizers, I was at a department store. I saw a man there who was complaining about how there was no hand sanitizer left. He turned to me and said, "If I had known that it would be like this, I would have bought a bunch of it and sold it on the street for a huge profit." I thought, you, sir, are not only the worst kind of person, you're a week late to the party. Not only do you strive to be a bad person, but you aren't even good at it. We also learned about social distancing. Keep a distance of 6 feet away from other people, which a lot of people don't seem to be able to grasp. I'm an introvert, so this comes really easy for me. A lot of this stuff comes really easy for me. In fact, I think for the first time, a lot of people in the world now understand what it's like to be an introvert. And it's like, my life really hasn't changed that much. Mostly because I'm always home editing podcasts. But even with me, it's affected me a little bit. You know, while I'm an introvert, I do like to get out and see people, and just those 1 or 2 times a week that I go out and see friends makes life difficult, just staying at home all day. And of course, one of our episodes was we were scheduled to do an interview, and it was canceled because the venue where the room where we usually record was closed. So we were kind of out of other options because it was such late notice that we couldn't record there. So we didn't really make other plans, and I was kind of bummed out because that was like the one thing I was really looking forward to. Of course, with social distancing, one lady recently walked up to me in a line. I was at a hospital, ground zero for illness. And she asked me, "Are you in line?" And I said, yes, I am. And she said, "Why are you so far behind the person in front of you?" Have you not heard about social distancing? Apparently, the memo didn't get out to everybody. Finally, there was the media hype thing. It was unbelievable to me how so many people stood by their stance that this was all just media hype. There is nobody who distrusts the media more than I do. I used to work in the media and I got burned really badly. I remember thinking that we, the media, were the good guys and that we were fighting against corrupt government. It was on a very local level where I lived at the time. I remember one day one of our reporters and I were alone at the office while everyone else was away. We were in the middle of a conversation about these so-called corrupt politicians, and he turned to me and said, "You know that we're the bad guys, right?" What? He said, "These are just good people doing their jobs, and we're harassing them and creating drama because drama sells newspapers." I was shocked. I felt betrayed. I never felt the same way about the news again. I turned into a huge skeptic of everything media related. I haven't really watched or listened to mainstream news since, at least not on a regular basis. Long before fake news became a popular mantra, people used to ask me why I hated the media so much. I think many others, finally, in the past few years, have reached the same point of disgust with the media that I felt since that day when my coworker dropped that bomb on me. That's how passionate my dislike of the media is. But that said, when people still say that this is all just media hype, my mind is blown. Do people really believe that a Republican governor would tank Ohio's economy so that a Democrat would win the presidential election in November? Do people really believe that the entirety of sports would be completely shut down because of media hype, voluntarily losing millions and millions of dollars? So much money is being lost. When I ask people why they think that this is all media hype, I tend to get some political response. Because of this candidate or because of that candidate is bad or that candidate's good. Since I don't really consume much mainstream media, most of what I have to go from is what I see in person. And I can tell you that it seemed very real to me. This has been an interesting time that reveals a lot about people's character. Which people think about what they say before they say it? Which of them share bad information without researching it first because it's so easy to do? Who fights for the greater good of the community? And which ones are self-absorbed? Who's looking out for senior citizen? And who still wants to go to the clubs? YOLO, right? Think before you speak. And think before you act. As I said before, everyone is experiencing this differently, and everyone has different fears about the future. Some people have lost their jobs, while others are worried about the potential of losing their lives. We all deal with these fears in different ways. Again, I want to give high praise to those who are on the front lines, doctors and nurses and other medical professionals, and even retail and grocery workers. And I'm sure there's tons of other essential workers putting themselves at risk to do what needs to be done. While the rest of us are hunkered down, you're fighting the good fight. Thank you. There's a lot of good happening out there. We've adapted and found other ways to socialize. Earlier this week, I attended a virtual coffee house hosted online by a friend of mine, where we all just sat around and talked like we would if we were at an actual coffee house. I've heard multiple stories of ladies forming support groups to help one another. If one mom doesn't have enough diapers, other moms step up and help. The unselfishness of people who seem so very willing to put their lives on hold so that our elderly are protected. It's an amazing thing to witness. All this unselfishness. While I was highly frustrated at the beginning of all this, ultimately I'm starting to see the good. I'm starting to see how the good in people overcome the annoyances. And that gives me a lot of hope. Anyways, be careful, everyone. Not only for you, but for the good of the community. Don't panic, but also think about the potential consequences of the small decisions that you make. Get out and go for a hike. 6 feet away from the next person. Take care of your mental health. The podcast will be different for a little while. Again, we'll try to be creative in the meantime, but we will work on getting back to usual as circumstances allow it. As always, if you have any feedback or want to share your thoughts or your story or just really anything in general, check us out on Facebook, on social media. The URL is facebook.com/The Cleveland Podcast. You can also check us out at theclevelandpodcast.com. We just recently updated the website so that there are links to other really cool local podcasts. A couple of them are really funny, and it might be good to have something like that to uplift your spirits while you're stuck at home. Anyways, I'm going to wrap things up. Everybody stay safe and be good to each other. Later.
Eh? Eh?